Okay, so we're back talking about Lost Highway. So the in a movie that's obsessed with masculinity and about Fred's inability to sort of sexually satisfy his wife and Mr. Eddie's sort of hyper masculinity that he's just gonna beat the shit out of somebody on the side of the road to be a tough guy. It's interesting that when Pete's parents talk to him about that night, and they don't go into detail. It's first of all, for Pete, whatever that night was, where he went somewhere and showed up in Fred Madison's death row cell. He doesn't remember what happened that night. Which is what you expect from some kind of trauma, some kind of really serious trauma that robs you of the memory of what happened. Please also notice that Fred does not seem to remember killing Renee. These kind of traumatic, violent events, they can't remember them, or they won't remember them, or they refuse to remember them. And that Pete's father, the way his parents talk to Pete, the way Pete's parents talk to him about that night, their eyes are brimming with tears, and they say, "We will never speak of that night. We won't talk about it. And I saw you with a man. I've never seen that man before in my life." His mother sort of hangs her head, so you can't see her face. The father's eyes are brimming with tears. It's the way you would almost expect someone to respond to like a very serious sexual assault, like the way the family members might, because they can't bring themselves to talk about it or put it into words, and there's these complex feelings of sort of shame and guilt surrounding whatever happened that night when Pete went somewhere, and again, there's that weird camera shot of, something entering into some kind of vagina-like, wound-like thing that is his transformation into Fred or Pete or whatever. That transformation, Fred's transformation into Pete, is led up to with that. So it's interesting in a movie about masculinity, that this is part of what the imagery suggests. What happens after that is Alice's plan to rob Andy, and run away with the money. I don't know, how much money did they get? She's like taking his necklace off. I mean, how much money can this be? It doesn't seem like a very good plan. It's not worth spending a ton of time on because it's the standard sort of film noir plot. It's just like Double Indemnity. The beautiful woman is like, I know a guy that I'm having sex with. You kill him, and then we'll run away with the money and live happily ever after. But then, of course, as soon as he kills him, he's like, we killed him, and she's like, you killed him, and she turns on him, right? She pulls the gun on him, and then she's like, just kidding, and then they have sex in the desert, and she walks away from him. So it's that she's led him into this life of crime only to abandon him and double cross him. But of course, in the David Lynch movie, she simply vanishes after performing this kind of femme fatale role. And I don't think we need to spend like a ton of time on it. Although, please also note that one of the things that really disturbs Pete about Alice is her enjoyment of sex. And we'll see that in our next movie, Gilda, which is also about, it's like the women enjoying sex is somehow a threat to the masculinity of some of our main characters. We'll see that in the next movie when we watch Gilda. But he's very disturbed. You enjoyed it, didn't you? He's very bothered by that. But it's the same thing that Fred's worried about. Is that Renee isn't enjoying sex with him? Is she enjoying sex with Andy? Is Alice enjoying sex with Andy? Is she enjoying the pornography? It's a constant worrying in his mind that someone else is providing her with pleasure, and that this is a dangerous thing that he has to control. Right? Just like Fred wants to control his wife, make sure she's not cheating on him. Alice enjoying sex with other people other than Pete feels like something he has to control or do something about. Yeah. Okay. So they rob the place. Please notice also that Andy's, I mean, there's not a whole lot to do here, but like Andy going through the coffee table. It's a crazy bonkers scene, but it's also another head wound in a movie about people's minds being messed with. And Andy's hit over the head. The table goes into his head. Fred has headaches. Pete has headaches. Pete's got a head wound. It's this kind of repeated thing. It has to do, because a lot of this movie it's psychosexual. It has to do with the mind. And it's a big kind of repeated thing. And the longer the movie goes on, the more you start to see these echoes of Fred's life show up. So when the mystery man talks to Pete, he uses some of the same phrases he used with Fred. I met you in your house. You invited me. Don't you remember? Cool. Okay. The flashback to Alice meeting Mr. Eddie. again, is drenched in the same imagery that we've seen earlier in the movie. The fire, the red curtains, right, is very similar. The red curtains and the fire are associated with the cabin in the desert. They're associated with Fred Madison's house. And if you know David Lynch in general likes these images: the fire, the curtains, the blue velvet curtains, the flickering candle in blue velvet. So these are sort of, this is the symbols that come to David Lynch's mind, but it's also the things that unify the different sections of the movie. That it doesn't logically make sense, but some of the same imagery occurs, and that's part of how the movie kind of holds itself together, because it's not holding itself together by having a single main character who has a normal personality. It's all these different people, and it's hard to know what the relationships are. But what gives it continuity is the kind of links in imagery more than what normally holds a movie together, which is one main character. See also 2001: A Space Odyssey. Okay, cool. So as the movie goes on, too, it begins to disintegrate. And I mentioned those points in which the movie appears to be, it draws attention to itself as a movie. When things get intense for the characters, the camera actually has trouble focusing. Like, it's like the focus on the lens starts slipping and things become blurry. And I don't think it could be something that's physically happening to Pete's vision, but it also feels like David Lynch, like the movie is getting so intense that it is itself starting to disintegrate a little bit for me, the guy in the audience. You'll see the same thing pop up in Persona, when the most intense point in the movie Persona, the film literally disintegrates, and we'll talk about that when we get to Persona. So, for example, when one of the more intense moments is towards the end of the movie, when Pete sees Renee and Alice in a photograph, and he's like, "Is that you? Are they both you?" And again, Patricia Arquette, Alice, Renee, right? These multiple people, multiple identities, doppelgangers and copies and these kinds of things, the uncanny, as we talked about. But then the movie becomes intense and it starts to disintegrate. The film itself starts to disintegrate, where the lens can't focus on things. But also the setting starts to disintegrate in a dreamlike way. So that he says, "Where's the bathroom?" And he goes upstairs. And then the hallway of the home becomes like a motel. If you've ever had a dream, this is what dreams are like, where you're in your house, but you're also at Yankee Stadium, and it's somehow both. Pete is in Andy's house, and then he's also in a hotel, and there's like a room 26, and he opens the door, and Alice is in there having sex with another guy and making fun of Pete. And again, that's Fred's worst nightmare, is that she's making fun of him being a whiner while having sex with someone else. And then more stuff starts to come in from the Fred story. Alice's car, for example, that she drives out to the desert, that's Fred's car from the beginning of the movie. Cool. And then comes the key moment, the sex scene in the desert. I mentioned earlier when Fred and Alice are having sex, when Fred and Renee are having sex, there's like this muffled song you can barely hear. You hear that song again when Fred is in the jail cell and he gets the curtained vision of the backwards, the imploding cabin. But the song plays loud, like, so you can properly hear it during the sex scene in the desert between Pete and Alice. And it's really the most crucial moment in the film. Because so much of masculinity, as we've seen in so many of these movies, and we will continue to see, is men's desire to control, to own women, to sort of fully control them. And I was watching this with some students a couple of years ago, and Pete and Alice are having sex. And he says, "I want you, I want you." And one of my students says, "I think he's got her." But he doesn't, because having sex with someone doesn't mean that you own them, or that you know everything about them, or that you can fully control them, or that they are you. And she gets up and she walks off in platform stiletto heels in the desert, which is just truly glorious. But she walks off because he's learned a lesson about how he can't have her. And this is really the link between Fred and Pete, which is Fred couldn't satisfy Renee. And so he felt like she wasn't really his. So if you imagine Pete as being like a fantasy of Fred's, where he's younger and more able to satisfy women in bed, even if he could satisfy her in bed, that still wouldn't allow him to own her. And that's why she says to Pete, "You'll never have me." And then of course that is the moment in the movie that Fred comes back, because he's done this twice. He's tried to control and own a woman, Renee, and it didn't work. But then he was like, "If only I was younger and sexier." Still doesn't work, because men don't get to own and control and fully own another person in that kind of psychological way. All right, pick it up on probably the last video.